The earliest discovery of sourdough likely felt accidental and strangely miraculous to ancient people. A forgotten bowl of grain and water warmed by a hearth and left alone, transformed into something alive and fragrant overnight. People who witnessed this change learned quickly that the ordinary grain could host invisible life, and that those microorganisms could make dough rise and flavor bread in unexpectedly complex ways. That same accident birthed a tradition that would follow human civilization for millennia, carried in jars and bowls from one kitchen to the next. Before sourdough was ever named, people domesticated grains and learned to mill and mix them into basic doughs. Agriculture created surplus grain, and surplus grain begged experimentation with water and heat and time, turning necessity into culinary curiosity. Over generations, those trials accumulated into recipes and rituals, and early bakers learned that time itself, left to work, could create leavening power beyond human hands. That slow alchemy of grain and time laid the groundwork for all fermented breads that followed. The accident that created sourdough was simple and repeatable in kitchens across the world. A bowl of flour and water left in a warm corner fermented naturally as wild yeasts and bacteria colonized the mixture, producing bubbles and sour aromas. People discovered that keeping a bit of that bubbly dough and adding fresh flour created a perpetuating culture, a living starter that could be fed and tended, passing microbial life and flavor down through generations. That practice turned an accident into a household responsibility and cultural heirloom. What lives in a sourdough starter are not fairy tale creatures, but microscopic communities of yeasts and bacteria that do the heavy lifting of fermentation. Wild Saccharomyces like yeasts create gas and leaven dough, while lactic acid bacteria produce flavorful acids that shape the bread's character. Those microorganisms exist in a delicate ecological balance that depends on flour, water, temperature, and the baker's feeding rhythm, and this balance becomes a living fingerprint of place. Understanding those microbes reveals why sourdough tastes different from one city, country, or kitchen to another. Culturally, sourdough became more than food. Starters became family members, inherited and named like pets, symbols of continuity through hardship. Those cultures were practical too, because maintaining a starter ensured reliable leavening in places without commercial yeast and during years of scarcity. A starter could travel with migrants, survive ship voyages, and anchor new communities to old flavors, serving as a living connection to homeland and memory. In that way, sourdough was intimacy encoded in microbial culture, quietly preserving taste across generations. Regional traditions shaped sourdough into countless distinct expressions, tied to climate, grain types, and cultural habits. In San Francisco, fog and coastal temperatures favored specific microbes that created a distinctive tang that became famous worldwide. Elsewhere, rye bread in Northern Europe developed dense sour profiles under long, cool fermentations, while in Ethiopia multiple cereals produced the spongy, tangy injera linked to social and ceremonial life. Each regional method reveals how environment and culture co-create food identity over long time scales. Some of the oldest written references hint at fermented breads in ancient Egypt, where leavened flatbreads were part of daily life and ritual offerings. Bakers in those early civilizations likely guarded their techniques and exchanged starter cultures as valuable household assets. Archaeological evidence, including depictions of baking and descriptions of fermentation, suggests that the practice of nurturing wild fermentation was widespread and integral to early urban societies. The continuity between those ancient loaves and modern sourdough is a thread connecting past kitchens to our own ovens today. Ethiopia's injera uses teff fermentation methods that create a uniquely spongy, sour flatbread central to communal meals and identity. That practice shows how fermentation adapts to local grains and culinary uses, producing textures and flavors suited to specific food cultures. Across Africa and Asia, other fermented grain breads evolved in parallel, each leveraging local microbiota and methods, and in doing so, they illustrate the astonishing adaptability of grain fermentation across environments and cuisines. Understanding injera and its relatives opens a window into the global diversity of sourdough techniques. In Eastern Europe, rye sourdoughs created dense loaves that carried well through long winters and riverine trade routes. Those breads became staples for peasants and city dwellers alike, resilient against spoilage and rich in sour flavors that complemented preserved meats and fermented vegetables. A tradition of rye starters, millstone milling, and long cool fermentations gave rise to breads that tasted of soil and climate, a culinary terroir comparable to wine. These loaves tell the story of survival, trade, and regional taste, shaped by necessity and environment. The basic science of sourdough fermentation is a conversation between enzymes, yeasts, and bacteria that transform grain into bread. Enzymes and flour-free sugars that microbes consume. Yeasts produce carbon dioxide that creates rye. And bacteria produce organic acids that shape aroma and preservation. Temperature and hydration steer the microbial community toward different metabolic pathways. So small changes in the process yield large differences in taste and crumb. That sensitivity is why bakers obsess over minutes and degrees, knowing fermentation is chemistry lived in time. A sourdough starter is essentially a microbial ecosystem with a unique fingerprint shaped by local flour, water, and air. Studies show that starters from different places host distinct species mixes that produce characteristic flavors, and that those microbes can be surprisingly stable over years. This microbial terroir means that even when bakers use identical recipes, their bread tells a different story because of invisible regional influences. Recognizing starters as ecosystems reframes baking as ecological stewardship, not just recipe following. Flavor in sourdough arises from dozens of compounds produced during fermentation, including lactic and acetic acids, esters, and other volatile molecules that our noses translate into complex sensation. Those compounds interact with a Maillard reaction during baking to produce a richly browned crust and deep caramelized flavors. The result is a loaf that can taste citrusy, nutty, tangy, or wine-like depending on fermentation choices and flour composition. Learning to taste sourdough is learning to read microbial biographies written in acids and aromatics. Texture and health perceptions of sourdough have driven renewed interest among consumers and researchers alike because fermentation changes flour structure in measurable ways. Lactic acid bacteria partially break down gluten proteins and ferment complex carbohydrates, often making bread easier to digest for some people. While sourdough is not a cure-all, those biochemical changes can reduce some antinutrients and increase bioavailability of minerals, offering nutritional benefits beyond flavor alone. Understanding the interaction between fermentation and digestion gives sourdough its modern appeal as both tradition and functional food. Traditional sourdough methods relied on whole grain flours, long fermentation times, and hands-on practices like folding and bench resting to develop gluten and flavor. Stone mills and local grain varieties contributed to distinct textures and aromas that industrial processes often erased. Bakers managed starters by feel and observation, learning rhythms of feeding and rest tuned to seasons and temperatures, producing loaves that aged well and tasted of place. Those methods demanded time and attentiveness, which is why sourdough was once central to household labor and identity. Modern industrial baking simplified fermentation using commercial bakers' yeast to produce consistent, fast results that fit mass distribution models and urban lifestyles. That shift prioritized predictability and shelf life over complexity and regional character, reshaping bread consumption worldwide. Industrial bread making also separated consumers from the processes that create flavor, weakening ties to local grain and microbial ecosystems. The consequence was a homogenization of taste and a loss of skills, once transmitted within families and small communities. In recent decades, a revival of interest in sourdough has emerged driven by artisan bakers, home hobbyists, and a hunger for authenticity in food culture, social media, and small bakeries amplified stories of generations, old starters, and single-origin grains, making craft bread desirable again. This revival blends scientific curiosity with nostalgic longing, attracting chefs, microbiologists, and weekend bakers alike who seek connection through hands-on fermentation. The result has been a new ecosystem of education, small production, and community around living cultures and slow baking. Contemporary artisan techniques borrow from traditional wisdom while applying modern science to extend control and consistency in fermentation. Bakers now use temperature-controlled proofing, fridges, digital scale, and measured hydration percentages to reproduce desired flavors reliably. At the same time, many artisans insist on hand-shaping, slow bulk fermentation, and locally milled flours to preserve character, blending precision with craft. This hybrid approach shows how technology can honor tradition, rather than replace it, creating a nuanced middle path for modern sourdough. The mechanics of techniques like autolyse, fold and rest, and cold retardation are all about timing microbial activity to produce optimal flavor and structure. These steps slow or accelerate fermentation, allowing enzymes and microbes to extract sugars and build strength in the dough gradually. Mastery of these techniques gives bakers the ability to coax different notes from the same starter and flour, like a musician shaping phrases from a familiar instrument. Watching a baker orchestrate these stages is watching a living process move toward delicious resolution. Maintaining and sharing starters has become a cultural practice that weaves stories and communities, with bakers gifting jars at weddings and traders swapping cultures at markets. Those acts are practical and ceremonial, reaffirming social bonds through microbial exchange. Starter sharing also democratizes access to fermentation knowledge, allowing newcomers to learn faster through communal wisdom and inherited microbes. The ritual of feeding, tasting, and naming a starter creates meaning beyond mere bread making and connects people through shared nourishment. San Francisco exemplifies how climate and culture can create a regional bread identity, with entrepreneurs turning a local tang into an international brand. The city's legendary sourdough owes its profile to both particular microbial ecology and commercial storytelling that celebrated place-based flavor. That history shows how sourdough can be both a local tradition and a global commodity, illustrating tensions between craft capitalism and cultural heritage. The San Francisco case reveals how taste can become iconic, marketed, and mythologized beyond the oven door. French boulangeries carry another story of levain and precise technique, where sourdough traditions evolved alongside croissants and baguettes. The French method emphasizes texture and balance, using levain to add nuance rather than overwhelming acidity. Boulangeries preserved craft through guilds, daily rituals, and strict standards for flour and fermentation, creating a cultural infrastructure that supported bread as both art and staple. Observing those rituals shows how deeply fermentation techniques are embedded in national culinary identities. The economics of artisanal bread making present both opportunity and challenge, because labor-intensive methods raise prices while consumers seek authenticity and fairness. Artisanal bakers must balance local sourcing, sustainable practices, and viable margins to survive in modern markets. Those business realities influence choices about production scale, menu offerings, and community engagement, and they shape how sourdough culture reproduces in urban landscapes. Understanding these economics explains why some traditions persist, while others vanish under pressure from mass production. Scientists have begun to study starters with modern tools, sequencing microbial genomes to map the communities that give each starter character. That research bridges craft knowledge and empirical measurement, revealing patterns and surprising diversity within domestic starters. Researchers and bakers now collaborate, using data to refine methods while respecting the serendipity that produces exceptional flavor. This interplay between lab and hearth suggests a future where science enhances tradition rather than replacing the human element of baking. If you wanted to start a sourdough starter today, the process is wonderfully simple and deeply ritualistic, involving only flour, water, and patience over many days. Feeding schedules, temperature control, and observation replace instant results with a slow, rewarding relationship between baker and microbes. Learning to sense a starter's readiness through smell, bubble structure, and growth is part craft and part intuition, and it teaches humility about the limits of control. Starting your own culture invites you into a lineage of bakers who tended living food and translated time into flavor. For home bakers, the revival of sourdough has been social as well as culinary, turning living rooms and community centers into classrooms for fermentation. Online forums and local workshops demystify techniques while preserving the joy of experimentation and sharing successes and failures. Those communities foster resilience by teaching people how to nourish themselves with whole foods and slow processes, reconnecting daily life to seasonal rhythms and microbial reality. In this way, sourdough revival becomes a small sustainability movement grounded in practical knowledge. There is a philosophical side to sourdough that lives beyond technique, where bread becomes metaphor for continuity, reciprocity, and humility before nature's processes. Tending a starter is a daily act of care, a partnership with microorganisms that resist our attempts at absolute control. That partnership teaches us to respect time, to accept unpredictability, and to relish the results of patient attention. In a world obsessed with speed, sourdough advocates a different kind of value, one measured in flavor and memory rather than instant gratification. Modern chefs and scientists are exploring sourdough as a platform for innovation, experimenting with alternative flours, fermentation blends, and sustainability practices. These experiments push boundaries while asking whether innovation can honor lineage without erasing it. When new techniques respect microbial ecology and local grain, they potentially expand the expressive palette of sourdough without losing its soul. The future of fermented bread may be eclectic, grounded in both experimentation and reverence for the processes that have sustained humans for thousands of years. Across the world, small mills and regenerative agriculture movements are reconnecting grain production to local ecosystems, which in turn nourishes more interesting sourdough cultures. Flour matters because it carries native enzymes and microorganisms that help shape starter communities and flavor outcome. Supporting these upstream practices aligns culinary taste with ecological stewardship, encouraging a holistic view of food systems that recognizes microbial life as fundamental to flavor and health. The act of choosing a locally milled flour becomes an ethical and culinary decision. Sourdough's revival is not purely nostalgic. It responds to modern anxieties about industrial food chains, health, and cultural homogenization by offering a tangible alternative. People want food that speaks of place, history, and care, and sourdough provides those stories in a single loaf. When we hold a warm slice of sourdough, we hold centuries of experimentation, migration, and daily labor condensed into sustenance and ritual. That tactile connection explains why the craft of fermentation keeps returning to the public imagination. If you bake at home, cultivate patience as your most important ingredient and notice details others rush past. Because flavor is born in the margins of time and attention. Feed your starter with consistency, respect temperature, and learn to read aroma and texture before relying on clocks alone. Those small attentions create reward after reward, teaching the baker to see processes rather than products and to value the living systems that make taste possible. Baking sourdough is an exercise in humility and curiosity that offers daily proof of human creativity allied with microbial life. Around the world, bread cultures face pressures from monoculture grain production and urban lifestyles that prioritize convenience over craft, risking the loss of diverse fermentation knowledge. Yet, with renewed interest and intentional practice, communities can revive and adapt these techniques to modern needs. Preserving sourdough traditions requires both documentation and practice, passing down methods while encouraging innovation that maintains microbial diversity and cultural meaning. This dual approach can protect the living legacy of fermented grains for future generations. Ultimately, sourdough is a story about relationships between humans and invisible life that have shaped civilization without fanfare. From accidental fermentation to artisanal revival, these breads carry lessons about patience, place, and interdependence that remain urgently relevant today. If this exploration changed how you think about bread, then consider baking, tasting, or simply learning more about the microbes in your kitchen. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join us for more stories where history, science, and craft meet at the table.